Machiavelli's rule: the end justifies the means. Would you betray your morals if it guaranteed power? For most people, this would be an easy question to answer. They'd recoil in horror at the mere suggestion. But here's the thing: that very revulsion, that very disgust at the idea of doing evil things for power, is exactly what makes those who do and think twice about it all the more dangerous. These are the Machiavellian types, people like the Borgias, the Caesars, the Henry V's of history, individuals who operate by the cold maxim, the end justifies the means. In fact, this quote is actually from A Song of Ice and Fire, the book series on which Game of Thrones is based. In the series, it's one of the mottos of House Baratheon. It's also written on a sigil, a sort of dark mirror image of the family crest, which itself features a crowned stag. In other words, the Baratheons' own internalized self-awareness of their willingness to do anything to win the Game of Thrones. So with that in mind, let's go through how Machiavelli might argue the ends can justify the means, beginning with his famous claim that it's better to be feared than loved. Now, while it sounds brutal, this really just means that leaders shouldn't get too caught up in public perception. Yes, it's important to be liked, but it's not as important as getting results. As Machiavelli famously wrote, a prince should aim at being feared rather than loved, for this is to be the object of respect rather than affection. And let's be honest, even if you love your leader, if they're not getting results, you're probably going to start resenting them. You're going to start thinking they're not worth your adoration. But on the other hand, if you fear your leader and they're getting results, then there's no resentment. And this brings us to our next point, which is that morality is secondary to survival. It's not that Machiavellian leaders are immoral, it's that they place survival above morality. This is why they're willing to do whatever it takes to win. And this attitude of ruthless pragmatism is exactly what allowed the Medici to survive and thrive for so long. Now, of course, there's a cynical element to this, but there's also a realistic element. Morality is great when things are going well, but when things aren't going well, morality is the first casualty. So this brings us to our next point, which is that Machiavellian leaders will appear virtuous when it benefits them, but they won't hesitate to act strategically when necessary. That is to say, Machiavellian leaders know when it's important to appear moral and when it's not. They know that sometimes you have to get your hands dirty, but they also know that most people don't want to get their hands dirty. So they're willing to use that revulsion as a tool to manipulate others. They'll present themselves as virtuous so that others will be more willing to do their bidding. This is why we often see Machiavellian characters adopt the trappings of piety or religion. Take the Borgias, for example. While they were known for their cunning and ruthlessness, they were also incredibly pious. Both Rodrigo Borgia, who was Pope during the Renaissance, and his son Cesare Borgia were incredibly devout Catholics. In fact, Cesare Borgia was given the nickname the Divine by his contemporaries because of his piety. Of course, this didn't stop either of them from committing horrible acts. In fact, it made them more effective at committing those acts since they were able to manipulate people's expectations. They can appear pious and virtuous and yet still commit horrible acts. So now we come to the crux of the argument, which is that for Machiavelli, the ends justify the means. If something is good for the state, then it's justified. This is why he argued that a prince should be willing to do whatever it takes to ensure the survival and prosperity of their state, even if that means doing something that we today would consider immoral. But before we move on, I wanted to give a shout out to our supporters. Supporting the channel helps us continue making these videos and reaching more people with our message. We have some great perks, including early access, blooper reels, and more. Check it out. Now, this is where we need to be careful because there is a tendency to interpret Machiavelli's thought as advocating for unrestrained evil. He's often portrayed as the ultimate symbol of the immoral, manipulative, power-hungry individual. But this interpretation, while popular, is ultimately a misreading of Machiavelli's thought. Machiavelli wasn't saying that it's okay to do evil things. What he was saying is that sometimes it's necessary to do evil things. He understood that the world wasn't black and white, that there wasn't always a clear distinction between right and wrong. And he believed that leaders had to be willing to operate in the gray areas of morality if necessary. This is best exemplified by one of Machiavelli's most famous quotes: "The ends justify the means." Now, this is a controversial quote, to say the least. But what Machiavelli was actually arguing was that the ends justify the means in certain circumstances. Specifically, he was arguing that if doing something bad leads to a greater good, then it's justified. Take, for example, the decision to drop the atomic bomb on Japan during World War II. From a moral standpoint, it was horrible. It was an act of immense violence and destruction. But from a strategic standpoint, it was necessary. The bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki saved countless lives, both Japanese and American. It brought an end to a brutal war. So was it right to drop the atomic bomb? Well, that depends on whether you believe the ends justify the means. Of course, Machiavelli's ideas aren't universally applicable. There are many things that are simply never justified, no matter what the outcome. But Machiavelli was onto something when he suggested that we shouldn't be so quick to judge those who operate in the world of politics. After all, politics is a messy business. It's a constant struggle for power and influence. And sometimes those who play the game the best are the ones who are willing to break the rules. We live in a world that often celebrates rule breaking, especially when it's done for profit or for the greater good. Take Steve Jobs, for example. He was a college dropout who went on to create one of the most successful companies of all time. Or Bill Gates. He dropped out of college to co-found Microsoft and is now one of the richest people in the world. Breaking the rules can lead to success. This is something that Machiavelli understood better than most. He was a 16th century Italian diplomat who lived in a time of great political upheaval. He saw firsthand the lengths to which the powerful were willing to go in order to maintain their power. And he realized that sometimes the rules just had to be broken. It's not surprising then that Machiavelli's ideas have been so influential in the world of business. Many of the most successful businessmen and women today follow Machiavelli's philosophy. They understand the importance of being willing to break the rules in order to get ahead. This is best summed up by another famous Machiavellian quote: "He who wants to do great things must not be afraid of going beyond the confines of convention. Those who want to succeed in business must be willing to take risks, to do things that others are not willing to do. They must be prepared to break the rules when necessary." Of course, this doesn't mean that we should all go out and break the law. There are certain laws that must be obeyed. But there are also many unwritten rules of business that can and should be broken. This is what Machiavelli was getting at when he wrote, "One must not act solely by the rules of morality, but also by the rules of expediency." That said, it's important to remember that Machiavellianism isn't just about breaking the rules. It's also about playing the game of politics as it's played. It's about understanding the rules and then using them to your advantage. Machiavelli was a master of this. He knew how to navigate the treacherous waters of Italian politics, and he used his knowledge of the game to help his patrons, the Medici, secure their power. So yes, Machiavelli was willing to break the rules when necessary, but he was also a master of playing by them. Ultimately, Machiavelli's philosophy of political realism was a breath of fresh air in a world of idealism. His willingness to confront the harsh realities of politics head-on was refreshing, and his advice on how to deal with those realities was invaluable. Now, of course, there's a cynical element to Machiavelli's thought, but there's also a realistic element that we would do well to pay attention to today. In a world of political spin and posturing, it's easy to lose sight of what really matters: getting results. Machiavelli reminds us that we shouldn't be afraid to get our hands dirty if necessary. He reminds us that sometimes the ends do justify the means. But perhaps most importantly, he reminds us that it's not enough to simply do good things. We must also be willing to do hard things, things that go against our natural instincts, things that we may not want to do, but that we must do if we are to achieve our goals. Now, it's not that Machiavelli was advocating for a world of evil, but he did recognize that sometimes evil is necessary to achieve a greater good. So if you find yourself in a situation where you're faced with an impossible choice, where you have to choose between doing what's easy and doing what's right, remember the words of Niccolò Machiavelli: "The ends justify the means."